The Philippine World War II Memorial Foundation is an organization for initiating, developing, and producing projects and activities that will educate and enlighten the Filipino people about our World War II history. By commissioning and sponsoring films, literary works, and other multimedia platforms, we envision to bring the stories of our fathers and grandfathers to light, their enormous sacrifices to free our country from foreign aggression during the darkest days of World War II. Through these stories, we aim to inspire the youth to emulate the characteristics of our heroes and to continually aspire for peace. With key Templars of World War II history as the Foundation's Board of Trustees, its ultimate goal is to build a museum and library as a dedicated repository of World War II archives, documents, and relics. A state-of-the-art museum aimed not only for learning and education, but more importantly, to honor our glorious past and inspire our future generations.
Good afternoon and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's a beautiful afternoon and thank you for spending the afternoon with us as we do the virtual book launch of our third publication, Against the Wall, by our author friend, Mr. Gary Alba. So for some, for some reminders, kindly make sure that your microphones are muted. And should you have any questions, we'll be having a Q&A portion later. Should you have any questions, you can type your questions in the chat box. Dun po, right at the bottom, you'll see the chat there and you can type in your questions there. Earlier, you saw a short audio video presentation about our foundation, what we do, and what our future goals are. For those who are interested, you can check us out. Our Facebook page is the Philippine World War II Memorial Foundation. And now to start off our program, let us listen for a few messages, for a message from the publisher, from the president of our foundation, Mr. Mario Abad Santos Benipayo.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's our foundation's goal to educate our fellow Filipinos about our country's World War II history by publishing books, producing films, and other multimedia platforms. We aim to feature the various aspects of life during the Second World War. Our first publication, Honor, The Legacy of Jose Abad Santos, is about the life of the late, great World War II martyr, Chief Justice Jose Abad Santos. This was followed by our second publication, Makapili, which focused on the very sensitive subject of collaboration during the war. And now we are very proud to release our latest publication, Against the Wall. This is our first publication which does not deal with militarism, battles, or war atrocities. Rather, this book looks at Philippine-Japan relations during the Second World War in a different light, through the eyes of a 17-year-old Rodolfo Alba, who was sent to Japan as a student at the height of the war. Along with 26 other young Filipinos, they embarked on an adventure that would change their lives forever. Through the dynamic and lively writing style of our author, he lets us in on the subject not many people know of or have written about. I enjoin everyone to get a copy of this wonderful book and enjoy a nice, good read. Thank you very much and enjoy your day.
Thank you, Mr. Mario Benipayo, the president of Philippine World War II Memorial Foundation. So before we start, this is Palada book. Here you go. So this is now available here. You can get your copies from us. You can message us online to our Facebook page. And it is also available at Solidaridad near UP Manila and at Popular Bookstore for those living here in Quezon City. All right. So for now, we'd like to present a short video presentation that we made about our book. So without further ado, let's start our program proper. Our first speaker will speak to us about Philippine-Japan relations during the war. He received his master's degree in Japanese studies from the National University of Singapore and his PhD in social sciences from Hitotsubashi University. He served as the director of the Japanese Studies program of Ateneo de Manila University until May 2020. He's currently a Japan Foundation Research Fellow, writing his book on Showa period boys magazines. Our dear viewers, let us welcome Dr. Carl Ian Cheng Chua. Dr. Chua, the mic is yours.
Okay. Thank you. Is there a possibility for me to share screen or? But anyway, I'll just wait for the to happen. But anyway, just to give you an idea what I'm actually going to be talking about. When Gary assigned me the idea of Philippine-Japan relations, this is not my field, but I try. I try in the sense that it was a project that was, oh, thank you. It was a project that was actually done by the books of Ikehata Setsuo and which Sir Rico was also part of, where we try to use Japanese sources in order to do this. But given that I'm working with Philippine sources, what I wanted to introduce was the Greater East Asia Conference. Basically, the Greater East Asia Conference, or the Daitoa Kaigi, was held in 5 to 6 November 1943, which invited the leaders that were under the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And it was a means for Japan to sort of present propaganda. Just to give you a picture of this. And it was actually highly documented. I have some clips, but they're also available online, so I won't show it for the brevity of time, right? But what makes it interesting is, as I was reading this, I came across Bertram Bandam. He's a Jewish, he was a Jew that was actually in the Philippines, and he talked about the philosophy of collaboration, and his talk is actually available online, so that's why the link is there. And he talks about how the problem and the issue of Laurel comes in. Where do I come in with this picture? I come in with the idea that, unfortunately, the then President Jose P. Laurel, in our Philippine history books, as far as what I was taught when I was still studying Philippine history, was that he was a puppet president to a puppet government, right? And what makes this interesting with his talk is he developed a philosophy of collaboration in which will be related probably to what Gary's book is actually related about, right? The idea that under the context of war, what will these people do? And given that Professor Bantam was just looking at Laurel and bigger people, we're now able to see this application within the space of regular Filipinos itself. So how are we supposed to review Laurel? And I looked at it from Laurel's speech. Thankfully, when I was discussing with Dr. Takefumi Terada about doing this, the interesting thing here was that during the Greater East Asia Conference, the Japanese actually asked all the participants to submit their speeches, to which Laurel refused. And because of his refusal, and this is probably so that the Japanese could probably censor or probably check the contents of his speech. And when Laurel actually refused this, the other leaders followed suit, which makes it interesting. Why? The Laurel speech is available online, but I actually put it in bold here. What I found interesting when I read his speech, Laurel wanted to emphasize that, yes, we are an independent nation, and he was actually using the speech of the Japanese, whatever propaganda there was, in order to turn it against them. That's why I'm not going to read the entire thing. He actually quotes in all of his speech, like, according to His Excellency, the Greater East Asia Prosperity Sphere is this and so on, but only when there is mutual respect with one another's autonomy and independence. When one prospers through others' prosperity, in all countries give expression to their true self. So the idea here is he was actually an interesting person, where he was using the words of the Japanese and saying that if you said this, then you should, you should comply with it. And he was really insisting on our independence. But this was not the only thing. Continued with his speech, he will always do this, parang in each paragraph, according to his excellency. The starting point, blah, blah, blah. But each nation may develop in accordance with its own institutions without any particular member monopolizing the resulting prosperity of any given country or nation. And remember that this is Jose P. Laurel speaking to the Greater East Asia Conference, and it was televised in NHK. So it was a very interesting thing that, wow, this president actually had the, for lack of a better term, the balls to actually say this and actually use the words of the Japanese against him. My last slide is this, right? That he would, when you look at his entire speech, His Excellency enjoins us all mutually to respect one another's glorious traditions and to develop the creative spirit and genius of its people. So in other words, in the end, what was Jose P. Laurel emphasizing here? He was now exercising as a representative of the Philippine government to give to the platform that he was given, that the Philippine government is an independent nation starting October, was it October 1943? And he was now reminding the Japanese of this. And this is just a brief concept that I wanted to present, wherein aside from what Gary's book is going to say later on, we're able to actually unpack more things about the occupation period, which we have not yet seen. And this is one way of looking at how Jose Pila was able to do this during the Greater East Asia Conference. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Carl. That was very interesting. Now ko lang I just read the entire speech now. And reading on World War II, yeah, I know he was really walking a tightrope, no? Anyway, thank you for that, Dr. Chua. And so we move on to our second speaker. Our second speaker will discuss the significance of Against the Wall in Philippine history. He is professor of history at the University of the Philippines in Diliman, where he also obtained his bachelor's and master's degrees in history. He then went to Tokyo University of Foreign Studies for his PhD. He specializes in military and diplomatic history with focus on the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. He has published widely in various journals and books and was recently awarded by the Metrobank Foundation as Outstanding Filipino Teacher in 2019. We are proud to present to you our next speaker and my mentor, Dr. Ricardo Trota Jose. Dr. Jose, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Des, and good afternoon to everyone who's attending this. First, let me congratulate Gary for his book, which is now finally in print. So let me go into what I prepared. So I'll try to present Against the Wall Significance in Philippine History. I wrote the introduction to the book, and I had to be careful that what I would say here would not duplicate what I wrote in the introduction. So this is something totally new. But let me just add a little bit to what Carl said earlier. I think one other very important thing about President Laurel's talk in November 1943 was that he delivered it extemporaneously. It was translated by an excellent interpreter, a Harvard graduate, Mr. Hamamoto, and that was actually recorded. The Japanese NHK recorded the whole proceedings in discs, and it was my great surprise when I actually listened to Laurel presenting the speech from the recording that was made at the time. But anyway, Laurel was on the higher level. This is the big picture, we might say. And Laurel came to Japan in 1943. He went to Japan in September 1943 before independence came. And already by that time, a group of students, a group of Filipinos were in Japan already under this new program, the foreign students from the southern area studying in Japan. And one of them was a very young Filipino at the time, Benjamin San Victores. His father was part of the Laurel entourage in September 1943. And it gave a very different perspective. What he remembered when his father came in and when he met Laurel, his impressions were quite interesting because they have not really been recorded. I did interview him many years ago, and that it was very revealing. But see, for most Filipinos, the Japanese occupation was a nightmare. Fear, uncertainty, hunger, death, and destruction are the descriptions we usually hear when people write or talk about their wartime experiences. For a handful of men, however, the war years were very different. These men were those who were selected to study in Japan, the supposedly enemy country at that time, and during wartime. Of course, Filipinos studied in the land of their colonizers before. Rizal and his contemporaries studied in Spain in the 1880s, but they did so at their own expense, unless they won scholarships or contests. During the American period, promising Filipinos were chosen to study in the US under government scholarships, the so-called pensionados. They were instructed in American ways, law, government, economics, education, and came back to the Philippines to become the foundation stones of the future Philippines. Laurel was in fact one of the beneficiaries of this pensionado program, and so were people like Jose Abad Santos and many more. But these students went in times of peace. The key figure in the book that Gary has written is Rodolfo Alba Sr., Rudy Alba, and his colleagues who went to Japan during the time of war. True, the Japanese were trying the American program for the pensionados. In fact, one might say that the whole system of these foreign students being invited to Japan was patterned after the American system, the American program. But this program was held during very abnormal times. This group of young men were called the Nampo Tokubetsu Ryugakusei, the special foreign students from the southern areas. And they were welcomed by Japanese families and developed close personal relations as with other Filipinos who studied in Spain and the United States. But again, this was during a time of abnormal conditions, a time of war, a time of hardship. And yet friendships developed at that time. In one sense, we can interpret this program, the Nampo Tokubetsu Ryugakusei, or the Foreign Students Program during the war, was a continuing Japanese policy from the closed door policy era, from the shogunates, where the shoguns would bring to Tokyo or bring to Kyoto, wherever the capital was at that time, the children or the wives or relatives of leaders, local leaders, just so that they would not rise up against him. They were thus held hostage. And in fact, in one sense then, these ryugakusei, or these foreign students in Japan, were in a sense hostages themselves. In fact, many of them were after all sons of national leaders. We can cite, for example, the son of Jose P. Laurel, Jorge Vargas, Osias, and others, who other members of the team or other members of the students who went in were scions of the heads of educational institutions. Rudy Alba's father was himself the head of one of the prominent universities, one of the prominent colleges in Manila at that time. But what made this experience unique, what made it different from, let's say, the ilustrados or the pensionados, was this was exposure not to an Occidental country. We had learned about Spain, we had learned about the United States in the schools. It had percolated through the years of colonial rule. But these ryugakusei were exposed not to the Occident, but to Asia, to the Orient. And this broke from the earlier exposure to Europe and the United States. This was the first time for many to really see what Asia was really like. What many people knew was the Inchikbeho, the Japanese in Manila, and so forth. So we didn't even have an Asian history course prior to the war in college. Nobody studied Japanese history or Chinese history. And here was this chance now, this opportunity to come face to face with this living culture during a time of war. And yet, even though it was a time of war, they were welcomed by the Japanese. Filipinos who were selected for this program came from different sectors of society. They came from different parts of the Philippines. One group of Filipinos who went to study in Japan were constabulary officers, and many of them had actually fought in Bataan. So one can imagine the potential conflicts, the potential contrasts and conflicting emotions as these young men headed for the country where they fought, which they considered they were at war with, which they could consider their enemy. And now they saw a different kind of Japan. Some of those who were from the constabulary would in fact develop better understanding of Japan, would take their studies seriously, and would continue the links that they had established during the war. Others who went, including Rudy Alba, were college students or even younger, in their teens. They were teenagers. They came from good families. They came from respected families. They came from various places in the Philippines. There were at least two, in fact, who came from Mindanao even. So it was an interesting group of people who went to Japan. They bonded together when they came to Manila to train in the Malacanang Palace area, the Malacanang Park area. And then when they went to Japan, they bonded more strongly together because they endured very strict Japanese classes, physical education programs, and so forth. And this tied them together in a way that very few people actually get tied together too. So again, we can look at the pensionados, we can look at the ilustrados, and we can see that they did form their own bonds in their respective countries. But again, this was a time of war. This was a time of extremely difficult conditions. This was a time when they could not really understand the language and they had to learn very quickly, and learn they did. So beyond interacting with each other, they also interacted more especially with ordinary Japanese. And one important highlight was that these Filipino ryugakusei, including Rudy Alba, met other Asians as well, because this ryugakusei, or this foreign student pensionado program as it was, did not only include the Philippines, but it also included students coming from different parts of Southeast Asia. You'd have Malays, you'd have Indonesians, you'd have Burmese coming together. And it was the first time for most of them to realize this person-to-person exchange. So not only were they interacting with Japanese on a very, very strong personal level, but they were also establishing linkages with other peoples from other Southeast Asian countries. This would become a strong foundation after the war to establish a stronger link with these other Southeast Asian countries. The ryugakusei did not stay in Japan very long, as compared to, let's say, the ilustrados and the pensionados. But they had perhaps the most intensive training anyone could ever have. The Japanese language was something that they had to learn. Although I studied in Japan also, I think their language skills are far better than mine. The Japanese way of life, which was totally alien to them before they came to Japan, they had to adapt to, they had to learn, they had to adjust. And growing to maturity, especially for the teenagers of that time. As has been said by many, war was something that compressed time. It made people mature overnight. And so all of the ryugakusei who went to Japan, whether they were Filipino or other nationalities, felt that they grew up very quickly. So some of the ryugakusei have written their memoirs and published diaries. I mentioned this in the introduction, some of them, mainly the constabulary students. But most of the college students, most of the teenagers did not have this kind of publication. Benjo Osias kept a diary, but the problem was that he wrote it in code. And I remember talking to Mr. De Asis long afterwards and saying, after Benjo Osias died, no one could decipher it because it's code that he only knew. So there were documents, there were diaries, but some of them were inaccessible. And so what makes this particular book unique, standing out, is that it is about a teenager who goes to Japan, studies in Tokyo, and then is assigned to the province, the Inaka in Kyushu. Young, very impressive, and it's here that he comes face to face with the Japanese people during a time of war, but very friendly. It was a different kind of Japan. It was not what the propagandistic elements were showing and so forth. These ryugakusei were but a handful, and I believe not one of them is left anymore. I think the last one passed away a couple of years ago. But the story is something that is reflective of a different angle of Japanese occupation and of World War II in the Philippines. It is one that has left connections, not only with the ryugakusei themselves, but with the children of the ryugakusei, as shown by Gary and as shown by the sons of the other ryugakusei who went to Japan during the war. So while they were a handful, and now none of those ryugakusei actually survives, if I am correct in that, you have their memories. And that's why it's very important that we have this book by Gary, because he documents not only his father's story, Rodolfo Alba Sr., but he also documents his own story. And Gary, who researched his father's life beyond the diary and the mementos that he had, like his father, Gary studied in Japan and kept up the good relations his father had begun. And he was ahead of me a year or two, and he pioneered in his own professional career. I knew both his father and his son. I knew both Gary and his son. Our paths crossed on multiple occasions, but that is another story. So I welcome the launch of this book as a contribution to the history of Philippine-Japan relations, to the history of World War II in the Philippines, and to the greater realm of Philippine history in general. One might even say this is also a contribution to the history of Southeast Asia as well, because Gary's father would have interacted with students from other parts of Southeast Asia. It is also a very personal story, which will appeal to everyone interested in a good read. So with that, I end my comments. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. And to Gary, congratulations. Omedetou gozaimasu.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ricardo Trota Jose. Thank you for that insightful talk. It's always a pleasure listening to Dr. Jose. Even though we always, he's my mentor, we always talk. Every time we converse, I always learn something new. Thank you very much, Dr. Jose. For our viewers, so you can see the live format. You can see a view icon on the upper right hand of your screen. Kindly press that. And then you see among the frames, there's one that says ATW book launch. So right click that and press pin. And you can see the live format, what's happening right now. So that you won't have a lot of, some other pictures or frames in your screen. Okay, so again, press view. Tapos po, lalabas yung ATW book launch, the frame. And then right-click that and press pin. Or for some, they can already see the ATW book launch. So it depends on how your screen is formatted. So just press pin so that you can watch it as it goes live. All right. Okay. So now we continue to our next speaker. We invited our third speaker to talk about the book from the Japanese perspective. Earlier, Dr. Jose talked about the book from the Philippine perspective. And our next speaker is an associate professor at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo, Japan. He received his doctorate in law from Keio University. Before joining the National Graduate Institute, he worked at De La Salle University in Manila and the Embassy of Japan in the Philippines. He teaches graduate courses on political science, focusing on Southeast Asian countries as well as other emerging countries, and has written several publications on the subject. Ladies and gentlemen, we bring you Dr. Yusuke Takagi. Dr. Takagi, you may now take the floor.
Thank you very much, Attorney Benjojo. very kind introduction, and thank you very much, Garrison, for your kind invitation. I'm so happy to see many old friends and a new friend here, even via Zoom. I haven't visited the Philippines for 2 years, and this is the only chance for me to see the people in Manila. And yeah, it's a great honor for me to say something about the great book by Garrison. I know this is a book of love by the son of a very important person in Philippine-Japan history. And I would like to emphasize 2 points to highlight maybe the significance of the book in terms of Japan-Philippine relations. First point is not written in the book actually, but it's an obvious fact. The author of the book. Actually, the author of the book is Mr. Gary, who studied in Japan and as a professional veterinarian expert. And it is quite fascinating because his father experienced the war. And of course, war was a tragedy, and the Japanese soldiers and generals made a great mistake. And then we do hope that no one repeat that mistake in the future. But despite the kind of tragedy during the war, his family decided to send their very important son to study in Japan. That is quite impressive to me. And this fact tell me the richness of the history of Philippine-Japan relations. Actually, Philippine-Japan relations never stopped at 1940s. Actually, Philippine-Japan relations, of course, went on the war after the war. And fortunately for the Japanese people, Filipino people still decided to come across the sea and then come to Japan and study abroad. Of course, many people study in the United States or as a part of the world, but some people decided to come to Japan. This is quite important foundation of two-country relations in this. In line with this, of course, I would like to appreciate the contribution by Cecilia-san, whose support was vital for Philippine-Japan relations, especially in the people-to-people exchange. I really owe a lot when I was at the Japan embassy, so I'm so happy to see her in this event again. And yeah, so this is the first point. Actually, the history of the person experienced the war, written by the son of that person, is quite important for Philippine-Japan relations. And the second point is about, of course, the contents of the book. The contents of the book reveals kind of daily lives of the Filipino people living in Japan. And as Dr. Rico Jose said, that it was a life of the inaka, rural life. And there is no famous soldiers. There's no famous politician in the book, but there are rich experience of the individuals living in the countryside of Japan. And this is also quite important to understand, to appreciate the richness of Philippine-Japan relations, because these days in the context of so-called great power rivalry between China and the US, many media pundits in Japan ask me about whether this new president is pro-China or not. But of course, president cannot dominate two-country relations, of course. And of course, the president's perception toward China is not that simple, first and foremost. But the more important thing is that the politicians, the business people can never dominate two-country relations. And I always remind the people who ask me about Philippine-Japan relations, one fact that Filipino people living in Japan is always third or fourth largest population in Japan in terms of international residents. This is quite important because when we talk about the internationalization and globalization, people always look at the people coming from America, people coming from Europe. The reality of internationalization of Japan tell us that Japan is in Asia and the Filipino people occupy a very important part of this real internationalization of Japanese society. And real internationalization of Japanese society reflects daily lives. It's not about politician speech, not about import, export, or FDI, but rather daily lives and the daily exchanges. And I'm not gentrify all the daily lives. Of course, there are many problems in Japanese society, and I know some Filipino people face a challenge in daily life in Japan because it's a foreign country. Still, people are coming to Japan. That is quite important for us to understand, to remember and recognize. And of course, many people, including me, I was in Japan, I was in the Philippines from 2010 to 14, and many people are living in the Philippines, throughout the Philippines, not only in Manila, but from Baguio to Davao, or maybe even in Palawan, and I'm not so sure about Sulu, but there may be. So there are many people-to-people exchange elements in these two countries, and this part of relationship is highly appreciated by the book. So this is a book about history, but this is also the book about Philippine-Japan relations from the kind of an understated kind of angle, which I mean is that grassroots interaction, which is actually a vital part of Philippine-Japan relations. So Garrison's endeavor is a welcome addition on this solid Philippine-Japan relations at the grassroots level. And I do hope that the readers appreciate the efforts of the Garrisons and also the efforts of course, Mr. Rodolfo Alba, who experienced a hard time during the war. And we do hope that we can enhance two-country relations at this level, not only at the business or political level, but at the grassroots level. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Takagi-san. As Dr. Takagi and Dr. Jose said a while ago, that usually the Filipino experience is that the relationship during wartime with Japan was full of hardships and sufferings. That's what many people remember, here in the Philippines. So it was really refreshing for me to read Gary's manuscript when he gave it to me 2 years ago. This is actually a fresh take, because all our publications have been about the war, the atrocities and the battles and everything. So this is, I think, one great thing about the book. It talks about the nice Philippine-Japan relations during the war. So we go on to our next speaker. So our next speaker will give us his personal reflection about the book. He taught Philippine history in the 1970s at the University of the Philippines, where he met our author, Gary Alba, one of his quote-unquote star students. Totoo ba yan, Gary?
Totoo yan. That's really true.
He finished his PhD at Claremont Graduate University, and by the 2020s, our speaker had completed decades of distinguished career as a professor at Phoenix College, at Arizona State University, and the Thunderbird School of Global Management in Arizona. He has traveled and studied in Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America. Let us all welcome our next speaker, Dr. Albert Celoza. The mic is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much. And it's indeed a privilege to be with all of you today in the book launch of Against the Wall. Almost 45 years ago, I met this young man in UP Diliman during my first years of teaching Philippine history and Asian civilization. He was a very lively student and always has something to say in class, and really social. And then one of the things that I recalled was that I typically lead students to travel around Manila, and we visited the Rizal Shrine in Calamba, Laguna. And so that was really quite a great experience. And I was really fortunate to meet Gary Alba and several students then in the engineering and the foreign service and other classes at UP. Now, that was back in the 1970s. Fast forward now in the 2020s, Gary Alba, I was very delighted to get an email from him. And so in the progression of the book, Against the Wall, reading it a number of times, actually, and putting my own markings, it really it really gave me a lot of things to imagine and to think about as a student of history. One of the things that really delighted me in reading all this is the life of in Manila in the 1940s, what Manila was like. And Rudy Alba was able to show this in his memoirs with of course Gary's annotation. The other aspect of this book that really struck me is the interaction between a student or a Filipino going to another culture. You know, we are global citizens in the Philippines, and you will find Filipinos all over the world, and cultural interaction. Much has been written of our history in terms of our interaction with the Spaniards and with the Americans. But this is a very good book, and I think the foundation is doing a good job pulling together the interaction between Filipinos and Japanese culture and the awareness of Asian culture. So an aspect that I really appreciate here is learning the language, immersing oneself in the culture. And then on a more personal note, I am really struck by Gary, and I called him a dutiful son. In the best of the Confucian tradition, he made sure that his father's unique experiences were recorded in his diary, photos, letters, and other memorabilia. And I get this feeling that these were all lovingly collected and kept, and in terms of memory. While engaged in his business throughout his life, the veterinary profession and all the businesses, he really expressed very clearly his vocation and love for history, the way I remember him back in the 1970s. And so I would like to encourage our young Filipinos to go back and really study history, to get the appreciation of what the country was like, what our culture is like. And so the book Against the Wall, it really has made a profound contribution to the literature of not only Philippine-Japanese relations, cultural change, cultural interaction. And I highly really recommend reading this book. You know, not because Gary is my star student way back in the 70s, but I think this is really very important for the developing historical awareness, global consciousness of the Filipino. So maraming salamat that naimbitahan ninyo ako para magsalita tungkol sa librong Against the Wall. At nire-recommend ako na basahin ninyo itong librong ito, at talagang hindi lamang nagtuturo ng kasaysayan, kundi yung marirealize ninyo ang buhay sa Pilipinas at ang ating kinabukasan bilang isang kulturang pandaigdig. So maraming salamat. Thank you very much to all of you for listening, and congratulations, Gary. And your father's memory is really well served and well kept. And thank you to all. Bye bye. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Saloza. I agree with Dr. Saloza. No, I love especially the first parts when Gary talked about his father's experiences when he was still a young boy here in Manila. I've read a lot about the pre-war Manila, so ang dami bumabalik, like the Tom's, Dixie Kitchen, and they're well known for their sandwiches and stuff like that. So now we invited Miss Cecilia Tolentino to introduce our author. So Miss Cecilia, after graduating with a bachelor's degree in foreign service at the University of the Philippines, she received an Asia Foundation grant to enroll in Japanese language and Japanese studies courses at the International Division of Waseda University. After her 2 years stay in Japan, she was employed at the UP Institute of Asian Studies, and in 1967, she started working at the Japan Information and Cultural Center of the Embassy of Japan in the Philippines. helping with its scholarship and cultural exchange programs. After retirement, she has served as advisor to some Japan alumni associations and is the Secretary General of the Philippine Federation of Japan Alumni. No better person to introduce our author but Miss Cecil Tolentino. Miss Cecil, your mic.
Good afternoon, everybody. I first met Gary when he came to the Embassy of Japan in 1985 for the interview of Japanese government scholarship applicants in veterinary medicine. And that was about 37 years ago. Gary was not recommended by any institution or educational group, but even during that time, he was already an outstanding veterinarian. He got the scholarship and he was sent to Kagoshima University in Kyushu. He was an outstanding student, and I heard that during the end of his term, he presented his paper at the 107th National Veterinary Conference in Tokyo. I knew his father, Rudy Alba, because he was very active in all the activities of the Philippine Federation of Japan Alumni and all other NAMPO activities. I knew also that two of Mr. Rudy Alba's colleagues, Attorney Leocadio de Asis and Mr. Consuelo Sioson, wrote books about their experiences in Japan during their student years. But they wrote books from the point of view of the constabulary group. It was only Mr. Rudy Alba who wrote from the civil group. And I was surprised and honored that Gary requested me to review the book that he was doing and he wanted to be published. But it's getting, but I would like to present to you our beloved author, Dr. Gary Alba.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cecile, Ma'am Cecile. I would like to welcome all the participants who attended this Zoom launch. Thank you very much, everybody, to Phil Ward, to Ms. Cecile, to Kagi-san, my professor, beloved Professor Albert Salosa, Professor Rico Jose, and Professor Chen Chua, Carl Chua. Now, I must confess that Against the Wall was not originally meant to be published. I was thinking of just writing down I'd like to pass on to my grandchildren or my nieces and nephews, and just as a memoir. But 20 years earlier, when I started, like in 1988, actually, when Cecil told you about my being in Kyushu for studies, I received a letter from my father, who enthusiastically explained to me that he was there in Japan during the war. And to me, at that point, I had so many other things in mind. I did not really have that as an important issue. But anyway, he mentioned that he had lived in Kurume, which is about 30 minutes away from Fukuoka, where I was studying my language course. And he was very explicit with the way he drew the map of Kurume, from the train station to the hotel to the school, to the church, where he had stayed most of his time after his language course in Tokyo. So he was very enthusiastic, and I said, okay, I'll probably take the time off one weekend and see what I can see, or find what I can find. And I did that. And it was very, very fruitful. So I was fascinated. That was it. At the end of my school term in Fukuoka language course, I used that experience as a lesson, as my writing, as my composition for my language course. And that was the end of it, actually. Now, when my father passed away in 2012, everything just collapsed around me, because I was taking care of my father during his last few years. So I started to do a lot of background check into what he did tell me about. Imagine that all of the stories he was telling me were from memory. At first, there was no notes, no diary, nothing, no books to base his stories on. He was telling stories like he was saying goodnight to me and telling me goodnight bedtime stories, very sporadic, very extemporaneous. I found it I found it fantastic. So many details. And yet, at the age of 83, he still remembered a lot 44 years earlier. So 2 years after he passed away in 2012, in 2014, I had no direction. And the only information I got as a background reference for their group in Japan was based on an American Professor Grant Goodman. And he had apparently interviewed the first 2 batches of pensionados who had left in 1943 and 1944, way back in 1962. So he made 2 manuscripts, for each of the 2 batches. And I took a bold step. I took a chance to write him an email, not knowing if it would reach him or not. But I asked people around if he had an email address that I could write to, and I did that. Surprisingly, in January 2014, I received an enthusiastic response saying that he was happy that I wrote. Finally, someone from the civilian group apparently wrote him, informing him that a book was being written, a story about the civilians who had left was being written. And he said to me that, he's happy, he looks forward to hopefully reading my book, and that I should rush because the number of people who have lived during that time, during the war, are fastly passing away. So there goes my pressure. So I had to find out. And sadly, 3 to 4 months later, 2014, as I was consulting Professor Rico Se, I learned that Professor Grant Goodman had passed away. So I said, wow, what a timely opportunity for me to have contacted him and receive some words of encouragement. And indeed, from then on, I started to pursue research online, basically. I went to libraries, I went to LaSalle, I went to Central Manila Library, just to be able to get some information. Now, I wrote the book as a commentary for the reader to get a good feel of the conditions my father went through as well. Encountered during those fateful years during the war. I remember my father was only 17 when he left. So you can imagine a very young person who has no idea of the outside world now is brought to a foreign land where he has no idea of the culture nor the language. So against the wall was basically something to describe a youthful experience and to explain to you that he survived because of his will to learn more. He wanted to learn academically, actually. He wanted to take advantage of the opportunities given to him. And he was also fortunate to learn about the culture. The culture was totally different and yet very, very gratifying to learn. Anyway, I will leave everything to you to read because I don't want to spoil your enthusiasm. But then I hope you really find the book very interesting in terms of something new, something new that I've recently found out is not available anywhere else. Not many people have written about it. I only encountered a Zaide authored book mentioned that a group of Filipinos were sent to Japan to study. And I never encountered any other history book mentioning about that. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I hope to see you again. If you have any questions regarding the book or our illustrious speakers, resource persons, please do. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Gary, and congratulations for this very the latest book that we have. Congratulations, and I'm very, very sure that Papa Rudy and Mama Benny are smiling down on us. But even also maybe Dr. Goodman, no? And finally, this is already in print. All right. For those of you who have questions for Gary and for our illustrious speakers, you can type it in the chat box. So Gary, I received one question through my messenger. I hope you can answer this. Did your father experience discrimination when he returned from Tokyo, especially that this was the time that war criminals and collaborators were being tried? So again, did your father experience discrimination when he returned from Tokyo, especially that this was the time that war criminals and collaborators were being tried?
Well, I don't want to spoil, to make a spoiler alert here, but that was the fear, actually. Everybody who came from Tokyo, from Japan at the time, were either being incarcerated or did not have the opportunity to higher education here in the Philippines, or they just hid or took some, they had to fend for themselves. My grandfather did not wait for anything to happen to my father and decided that he should study overseas. And he was sent to the US, actually. So some would say, why? If he was a collaborator, then why would he go to the US? Exactly, but you must remember that before coming home from Japan, he worked for the US Army as a typist. So there was no issue. With the foreigners there, they had no issue. So that was the fear, yes. Most of the friends that he had coming home, they were not treated very well, unfortunately. In the Philippines.
A follow-on question. How many batches? Oh, sorry, I was muted. How many batches of pensionados were sent to Tokyo? Maybe in relation to, because the US had so many, the earlier days, we were sending so many pensionados in US. So how many batches of pensionados were there, were sent to Tokyo, and did the Tokyo government fund this? Would you know?
Okay. During the war, at least when it started, because it was only conceptualized earlier in 1941 or two. Prior to the war, it was already conceptualized, and they started to do this. And the first batch was with my father in 1943, and the second batch was in 1944. Right? After that, post-war, I think they started the Ministry of Education. Then after that, but as a start, it only was for 2 years during the war. That was the beginning.
All right. Maybe Dr. Jose would like to add something about the pensionado program under the Japanese government. Dr. Jose?
Yeah, it's true. There were two large groups. I mean, figuratively large. The one went in 1943 and the other one went in 44. You can subdivide it into the group of constabulary students. These are generally more mature people. As I mentioned, many of them had actually fought in Bataan in the defense of the Philippines. So they had that very peculiar, they were in that peculiar situation where they were in the land of their enemies. And they actually met General Homa while they were in Tokyo. And so I think Gary's father is different because he's from the younger group. No fighting whatsoever. But yeah, it was a very limited number. Only 2 batches went in 43 and 44. The first batch made it back home in 44. The second batch actually was caught by the end of the war in Japan. And some of them were actually close enough to Hiroshima to see the atomic bomb. And they had to make do. In the chaos of post-war Japan, they had to make do with however they could survive. That's another story in itself. But only 2 large groups, 43 and 44. And again, unlike, let's say, the pensionados or the ilustrados, they stayed for a very short time, 1 year, 2 years at the most, and during a period of war. But what is interesting is that they kept these memories so strongly. I mean, how they bonded together and how they bonded with their Japanese friends and how they bonded with their Southeast Asian friends, which still continues to this day.
Right, right. And that was very touching, yung part where we see that he was forming friendships with the civilians there and the Niseis, no? So, Dr. Jose, the Niseis were they asked to go home, to go back to Japan during the war? A lot of them, but a lot of them were interned in the US. But some Niseis were, sent back to Japan, was it?
Yes, it's actually a very complicated issue. Some of them remained because they had already invested so much in California and the US and Hawaii. And it's those who got trapped there and they were figuratively deported to the mountains and interned. But several of the Nisei did go back to Japan, some because they were called by their families. They knew that an emergency was coming. Others were realized that if the war broke out, then they had to, their country was really Japan. And it's something that no one has really written about yet. There were some who were collaborated with the army, and there were others who did not want to collaborate. They felt that this was beyond it's not what they wanted to do. Some of the Nisei were actually sent here as part of the Japanese army. So it's a very interesting story that has not fully been touched yet. Some of them have written books. Some of the other Nisei in Japan, of course, were eventually inducted into the US Army. Some served in Italy. The others became interpreters and translators for MacArthur's forces. And that's a very fascinating story as well.
Right.
But the Nisei story is something that the Nisei do have a museum. They have an archive in the LA area. But it's something that most people are not really that familiar with.
Right. And also this topic about the Japanese pensionados, very few Filipinos know of this. So we really welcome Gary's new book on this. No, and we don't have any other questions, but we do have a comment from Maria Alba. Says, "Hi, I am the older sister of Gary and the nosier one growing up. To those concerned, the book is only based on the memory of our 83-year-old father he had written love letters to my mom, who was the high school sister, and also letters to his family. Good thing for hoarders of mementos in the family. Yeah, I was actually so surprised that Mama Benny and Papa Rudy kept all these, no? Even the postcards, even what was the sakura petal still there? Oh
Yes,
my
I
god.
still have it. Yes.
Wow, amazing, no? So how old is that now? 80 years old, more or less?
44.
79. 43, and now it's almost 80. By
79.
next year it will be an 80-year-old petal. Wow, amazing.
Still
So
pink.
yeah.
It's still pink.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah, it is.
wow, amazing. Baka you can donate it to the National Museum of Natural History.
We'll see.
They can find out what pigments those are now, will last 80 years, no?
Good for the youth.
So congratulations, Mr. Alba. Your book is now officially launched. So for those for our readers, we enjoin you to get the book. Hindi talaga techie eh.
Oh, recording in progress.
Oo nga, mahirap po pag hindi techie. Nako. Konting mali lang eh. Konting mapindot lang, patay.
No record. No record.
Hold on. Okay, wait. And then start again. Ayaw eh. Maybe this one. Anyway, so the book is officially launched, and we enjoin you to buy and enjoy a very good read, especially to those who want to learn more about pre-war Manila. Mahaba po yung section on that, which is very, very, very interesting for me. And it's now available in Solidaridad and Popular Bookstore. And we'll work on bringing this to more bookstores as we go along the weeks, no. And this is actually the first, I think, commercially published book on the pensionados in Tokyo, because yung kay Mr. De Asis, I think, was privately published or something like that. So we will endeavor to bring this all over the country, and even outside. We can deliver, and we can courier this to outside the Philippines. So thank you. And before we go, we have some announcements. So aside from Against the Wall, we have two other books in our list of publications. We have Honor, The Legacy of Jose Abad Santos. And we also have the DVD of this, because we produced a film about this late great hero. And we have Makapili, our second book, which was written by Dr. Felisa Tan. Dr. Babit, I think Dr. Babit is watching. Hi, Ate Babit. So this is a close look at the Makapili and the paramilitary groups and informers and the collaborators during the Japanese occupation. No? This is a very touchy subject, very sensitive subject, and we commend Dr. Babit Tan for bravely doing this. And of course, our newest and latest publication is Against the Wall. So for those of you who want to order, just message us and we can deliver to you via Lala Move or Grab here in Metro Manila, and via JRS or LBC, in the provinces. And as you watched our AVP earlier, you saw that we have a lot of projects and activities. And our latest one is our exhibit opening next week, July 16 at Intramuros. So hopefully you can all come and watch and view this for yourselves. It's entitled Remembering World War II in the Philippines, and it's a narrative and pictorial exhibit of World War II in the Philippines. And we have captured rare pictures. Some pictures you haven't seen. I haven't seen them. We have included some very rare pictures here. And for those of you who want to learn more about World War II in the Philippines, please come. It will open on July 16th at 9 a.m. Thank you so much. And again, congratulations, Mr. Gary Alba. Thank you for choosing to publish with us. And I know that Papa Rudy and Mama Benny are smiling down on us right now. And I know because Mama Benny is we have the same birthday. Thank you so much, everybody. And please get your copy now. Gary, would you like some last words to your fans and to the viewers?
Well, sorry. Yeah. Thank you very much again for taking your time to watch this book launch. I'm thankful to Phil War, of course, Desiree, to Professor Jose, Professor Solosa, Professor Caracha and Chua, who were my guide. Cecil, thank you very much for very generous introduction. And to those who have really, I know it's a working day, and some of you are still probably at the office, I don't know, but thank you very much for being here for me. Thank you. I hope you enjoy the book. It's available. You can always order through Desiree. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our illustrious speakers, Dr. Rico Jose, Dr. Carl Chua, Dr. Yusuke Takagi, Dr. Saloza, who, by the way, is in Arizona, and it's 1 a.m. there. So now it's 2 a.m. na pala there in Arizona. Thank you, Dr. Saloza, for doing this for us, and Miss Cecilia Tolentino. And congratulations again, Gary. Your book was officially launched. All right. Thank you, and we hope to see you. And please tune in to our Facebook page, Philippine World War II Memorial Foundation, for more publications in the future. And if you're interested in World War II history, we have a lot of activities for you. Thank you, stay safe, and enjoy your afternoon.